You're listening to the Rewilding Earth podcast. The Rewilding Earth podcast is supported by businesses such as Patagonia and Catula, the Whedon Foundation, and listeners like you. If you love the work Rewilding is doing, please consider donating at rewilding.org, and be sure to subscribe to the podcast while you're there. Professor Tom Rooney is an ecologist, conservation biologist, and advocate for good stewardship of wild places and the wild things that live there. His scientific reputation is built on the management problems and challenges posed by white-tailed deer. His research examines the role of deer in forest ecosystems and has been featured in the New York Times, Science Times, Discover Magazine, Washington Monthly, Nautilus Magazine, and other publications. Today I spoke with Tom about his work in the upper Midwest, and he had some surprisingly good news around wolves and their effects on flora and fauna in the region, as well as what it might take to improve connectivity among the areas affected by high road densities and other barriers to wildlife movement. Can you give us some background on how you came to be involved in the Wright State University conservation work that you're doing?
Sure. It's been a bit of a long journey getting here, and I'll take it back about 25 years ago. I was an undergraduate student at the University of Delaware, and started getting involved in ecological research, and was actually started working with predators way back then. The predators were a lot smaller. They actually fit into my hand. I was working with praying mantises and wolf spiders. And the research group I was working with there were among the first to demonstrate trophic cascades in terrestrial systems involving invertebrate predators. So I've been doing work on trophic cascades on and off for about 25 years, but it hasn't always involved wolves. From there, I ended up hooking up with Don Waller at the University of Wisconsin, and his group was in the late 1980s and early 1990s. They were really delving into deer impacts in northern Wisconsin, but more broadly, in areas where there was just an absence of apex predators. And I worked on plants for my PhD under his supervision, and worked on trillium, the large white-flowered trillium, which I think many people in the East know is one of the great charismatic wildflowers of the woods. And this is a species that's particularly impacted by white-tailed deer. So I worked on plant-herbivore interactions for a PhD. And then later, after getting a faculty position here, I was able to broaden out a little bit and start looking at the broader web of interactions in forests, and started looking at the role of wolves as they shape those plant-herbivore interactions. So that's sort of how I got here.
For our listeners who are in different parts of the country or the world, the history of the wolves in the Great Lakes region, I think you have some surprising things to tell people.
Sure. When most people think of wolves in the lower 48, they think, it was an extirpated species that was then reintroduced in the Yellowstone. And perhaps there was this remnant population up in the Great Lakes on Isle Royale. And that's not entirely correct. In fact, when the Endangered Species Act was put in place in 1973, there was still not a sizable population, but a viable population of wolves in northern Minnesota. So Minnesota, up by Lake Superior, had one of the last populations of wolves in the lower 48. And around the same time in Michigan, on Isle Royale National Park, there was a wolf population that had naturally established from Canada back in the 1940s or 1950s on that island, where they were feeding on moose. So the Great Lakes region has had wolves present more or less continuously throughout the 20th century. Although that began to change in after the Endangered Species Act was implemented. With protection, wolves were actually able to extend east from Minnesota into Wisconsin and then into the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, where they found an abundance of habitat and an abundance of food. Where I do my work in Wisconsin, they appeared in the 1970s, as best we can tell, probably about the mid-1970s, and it was really two brothers that were out trying to track wolves in northwestern Wisconsin on snowshoes and skis, trying to do about 30, 35 miles a day through the most remote habitats they could find. And they had evidence of tracks by the mid 70s, and so we had confirmed that the wolves had reestablished. And what happened was some work was done in the 1980s saying, well, there's where we know the wolves are, they're roadless areas, there's very few people, there's lots of deer, and there's not a lot of places like that in the States. So we're thinking maybe 100, 150 wolves will be able to ultimately establish in Wisconsin. Fortunately, their model was wrong, and wolves initially did settle in those areas, but then began spilling out into areas with higher road densities, higher human population densities. And today, in the Great Lakes region, there's between 4,000 and 5,000 wolves, including about 900 in Wisconsin.
Could we call this a rewilding success story, at least in part?
We can, because the wolves have essentially undergone exponential growth for more or less 2 decades in this region. So at least in the northern third of Wisconsin and the upper peninsula of Michigan and the northern tier of Minnesota, it's actually quite common to see wolf sign, whether it's tracks in winter or scats in the spring and summer. When I take my students out in the field, usually it takes us all about 15 or 20 minutes to find a wolf sign once we start looking for it. Wow. So the wolves are there. They're common. They're not always easy to see, but they actually have. A Forest Service friend of mine in Wisconsin once told me, "Yeah, our area is now pretty thick with wolves," which is not a phrase you hear very often.
I don't think I've ever heard that before. Which probably makes my next question totally obvious. Why? Why do you think? I mean, because it just occurred to me as you're talking about all of this, I'm not used to hearing success stories related to wolves, for one. And secondly, I do hear about the massive struggles that they're having in Oregon and Washington with wildlife services, and it's just basically an all-out war on wolves. They just killed, aerial gun down a wolf pup that didn't even have the teeth to be a threat yet in the Northwest recently. And why are you guys having such a completely opposite, or is it contentious in your area? Or do you have any sense of how to compare the two, what sound like wildly disparate situations for wolves?
Boy, it's there's not a short and easy answer to your question, but I'll start off with why they've been so successful, and that is when wolves recolonized the Great Lakes forests, you had a handful of wolves, and in Wisconsin, for example, 250,000 deer. So there was basically no shortage of wild food that they could sink their teeth into, and with the very high deer densities, more or less throughout the state, they were finding suitable habitat almost everywhere. So the wolves were able to expand across the landscape quite rapidly. And because there was such an abundance and even distribution of wild food, the conflicts involving people were actually quite low. A second piece of the puzzle is that in the Great Lakes region where the wolves are, these are largely forested areas where farms and raising a livestock is actually uncommon. And so as a result, you end up with fewer conflicts between farmers and ranchers and with wolves. Minnesota has actually been quite successful on sort of the border region where you do transition over from forests to farms for a number of decades, where when you'd get a problem wolf, that wolf would be very quickly be dispatched. And it's typically juvenile male wolves that are inexperienced that cause the bulk of problems on farms. And if you can basically eliminate those wolves or move them to some other area where they're not in contact with people, that solves the problem quite quickly. So the conflicts were just not as intense as we're seeing out further in the West. And then sort of a final piece, it's not to say everything is all well and good with wolves. They're still fairly controversial in the Great Lakes region, particularly in areas where people live. There are a lot of conflicts involving people and their dogs, particularly hunting dogs. And with wolves now on the landscape, a practice where people would hunt bears with dogs has become extremely risky because wolves will not tolerate dogs in their habitat, and as a result, will often kill hunting dogs as they're trying to flush bear. So that's also spilled over a little bit and is affecting domestic people's pets as well. You can't let your dog out in the yard anymore unless it's fenced in. So there are conflicts that persist in the Great Lakes region as well, but there's sort of a different kind of conflict than we see out in the western part of the U.S.
Yeah, I think out west they would love to have your problems, right?
That's right. I can tell you last year in Wisconsin, there were maybe 30 farms that were affected by wolves, and about 30 or 40 instances of reported dogs being killed by wolves. So just to put some numbers on it, it's not a huge problem.
Speaking of numbers, what are the effects of wolves in the northern Midwest having on deer and moose numbers and behavior? I bet you guys have all kinds of cool studies going on around that.
You would think there'd be all kinds of cool studies. There have actually been relatively few so far to date, but I'll give you a flavor of a couple of things that we're finding. First, sort of the big picture, if you look at some of the work that Bill Ripple and Bob Besch are doing out in Yellowstone and some of the western national parks, you're seeing very spectacular changes in response to wolves coming back in the landscape. We see sort of a much more muted response or a more subtle response in the Great Lakes region. And there's all kinds of reasons for that. But, it makes our job as scientists a little bit harder. We need to look a little harder and get a little bit more creative in terms of how we approach the problem. So if we were to rank the various threats to deer in the Great Lakes forests, the number one threat to deer is weather. Cold winters kill deer, and once March and April start rolling on, and they still have a thick snow cover, the deer are getting their fat reserves are depleted, and they just end up dying off, especially if you get a cold snap late in the season. So winter remains the number one killer for deer in this region, and then second, people, and the 9-day gun season is sort of the second sort of major source of mortality for our deer. And then as you work your way down, we find bear and bobcat end up doing quite a number on deer, coyotes as well, particularly during the fawning season, where for about 3 or 4 weeks a year, those three predators end up taking tens of thousands of deer collectively. And wolves themselves are only taking about maybe 20 to 25,000 deer a year. So it's not having a big effect when you consider there's about 1 million deer in the state of Wisconsin. However, what the wolves are doing, which none of the other predators are doing, is they are a year-round threat to the deer, and as a result have greatly altered deer behavior. And I think that's where we start to see the effects that cascade out into the vegetation and into the other wildlife. It's not because deer have become particularly scarce in the landscape. It's just that they're starting to use their forest in a very different way, in a more cautious way, in a way that's actually benefiting lots of other wildlife. For example, when I first started looking at this problem with one of my graduate students, Crystal Bouchard, we were looking at 3 plants that back in the 80s and 90s, we were looking at as these were indicators of overbrowsing by deer. We were looking at the blue-bead lily and large white flower trillium and Solomon seal, 3 plants that deer just absolutely hammer when deer become abundant. And what we did was we looked sort of across the landscape, and we looked at places where wolves had been established for over a decade. And then we looked at different places where wolves were just starting to come back or where they hadn't arrived yet. And what we found was once wolves had been established for a decade or close to 15 years, we saw that the plants in those areas were bigger, usually 30 to 50% bigger. They were about 2 to 3 times more likely to reproduce. And so there was sort of this whole change taking place in the forest understory with the wildflowers, sort of as exemplified by these 3 particular plants that we used as indicators, which sort of showed us that when the wolves arrive, the plants sort of move into this slow motion celebration phase, where it's like, hey, they're gonna stop eating us, and it's time to start flowering and reproducing for the first time, often in decades. So that was one of the first things that we saw. Another type of effect we saw was just an increase in species richness of trees and shrubs and wildflowers in habitats that we thought were areas with an unusually large amount of deer browsing pressure. So in our region, we have these sort of low-lying forested swamps dominated by white cedar with a sphagnum moss in the understory, and then all kinds of really cool wildflowers that grow in those areas. And these are areas that deer could go into in the summertime and just eat all this beautiful lush vegetation. However, with wolves on the landscape, these areas sort of became a bit riskier because you don't want to walk into a swamp where you could easily get stuck if there's things around that might kill you. So what's happened was we saw that when wolves came back on the landscape, deer basically stopped foraging in these places, and we saw a big increase in the diversity of tree saplings, of shrubs, and of forest herbs, all sort of returning to these cedar swamps that hadn't been seen in decades. So these particular habitats where deer are exceptionally vulnerable seem to be recovering the fastest of what we see out there on the landscape.
Yeah. That meme that continues to go around to this day of wolves and how they change the shape of the river. I can't even remember who put that out at this point or what river the study. I think it was Yellowstone, possibly.
It was possibly Yellowstone, and that was based on some of the work that Bill Ripple and Bob Beshta had done.
Oh, wow. So we're coming a little full circle here.
We are.
I love what you just described because it's a description that could have a video of its own, right? Maybe
That's
it
right.
does. Have you guys gotten into the viral video business up there?
We haven't. Rama Callahan took some great pictures of the cedar swamps of cedar swamps where the wolves are absent or rare, and then where the wolves were common and have been around for several years. And you can even these black and white photos in the Journal of Ecology. It's really apparent that one has had deer impacts for decades, and the other just seems to be. You'd swear that there was a fence around it keeping deer out, but just with the response of the vegetation.
Well, this next question is rather geeky. I'm going to leave it geeky. I didn't rewrite it. And the geeks listening are going to love it. And then you may want to explain it a little bit before you give the answer. But this is from John Davis, our executive director at Rewilding. Would recovery of pumas in the Great Lakes region have additional trophic cascade benefits? Or is one top carnivore sufficient to play that keystone role? That was loaded with definitions begging for your help.
Boy, that's a great question. I've been thinking about that for quite a bit, and I'll tell you right now that my friends in Wisconsin DNR are sort of pulling out their hair and screaming, "No pumas! We've got our hands full with wolves. Please, no pumas." But to the question, we see. I think that there's places in the Great Lakes forests where wolves would do better. There's better habitat for wolves in the landscape, and then there's other areas that are a little rockier with a little bit more of an elevation relief where pumas would do reasonably well. And wolves might be there, but not using those areas as sort of predator traps the same way that pumas might use them. So, the wolves and pumas both have very different hunting styles, and I think that they could end up being complementary. And I would love to do the experiments to see how that assemblage of predators would end up shaping not just wolves or deer, but end up shaping the whole community of mammals and then also plants and birds and what have you. Because I think we'd start to see some very different things with pumas. And just to give you an example, we think of wolves as they're predators of deer and of moose and ungulates. But one of the things we don't think about, and this is sort of an unstudied area that really needs some work, is that usually in the spring and summer, as beavers are starting to build their lodges and you have pups starting to leave packs for the first time, you've got these solitary wolves that are going out and they can't bring down a deer by themselves. And so a lot of them are actually eating beavers. And because beavers are such important ecosystem engineers, turning cold water streams into warm water ponds that then, eventually will convert over into open meadows. If you end up reducing the beaver numbers in the landscape, that's going to end up changing the way the landscape expresses itself, not just in the short term, but really over centuries. And so, there's all kinds of questions of, what happens when you introduce additional predators, because like the pumas are not just going to eat deer. Pumas will eat porcupines. Pumas will also go after, other mesocarnivores. So there's all kinds of cascades that can come into play that would be really interesting to look at. That we just, these are questions that we haven't even had a chance to explore or answer, given the decimation on our landscapes.
The DNR guys and managers of all kinds, Forest Service, BLM, Natural Resources, all those guys really do start to think that they are in charge of the distribution and effects of species, don't they? Because, they sort themselves out. Or weren't there a lot of studies on when the wolves were reintroduced in Yellowstone, the elevation change and where cats were hanging out was marked, and that there were other things that were observed? Don't these things sort themselves out in nature?
They do end up sorting themselves out. The thing about the wildlife managers is, they're the ones who hear from people who have complaints or have issues.
True, yeah.
But of course, the wildlife is doing what it's going to do, and we saw in Yellowstone. Different behaviors of the elk in response to wolves being on the landscape in terms of where they were foraging, even how they were spending their winters as a way of trying to avoid predation risk. So,
coyotes could run around and do whatever they wanted. The mountain lions could run around and do whatever they wanted, and you put wolves back in. It's almost like you put a hat and a badge on the wolves, and they just police the whole place back into some semblance of order.
It's crazy because where I work right now in Wisconsin, we actually have a fair number of coyotes and wolves coexisting, which really shouldn't happen. But because our coyote numbers are still relatively high, the red fox numbers are down, which I think is leading to an increase in the number of small rodents like mice, which has led to increases in things like the deer ticks and that are carrying Lyme disease and other human pathogens like anaplasmosis and borreliosis as well. So there's the chains of interactions just seem to keep going as far as we can see.
In that area that you're working, is it because that in that particular area there aren't enough wolves? Or, I've always been led to believe, as an amateur following all of these things as well as I can, that wolves seem almost like an instant panacea to overpopulation of coyotes. That's what we're usually told in the broader media, anyway.
It is true in the broader media sense. It's largely true in the West, and it should be true, except I'm not seeing it where I work, and I don't have a good explanation for it at this time. This is one of the things I have a student just getting started on with. We're expanding our camera trap network to get better handles on all of our canids, our wolf and coyote and red fox, and we're also looking for gray fox as well. But
it's really interesting to find out what's going on there.
We don't
usually hear that.
We have 2 wolf packs on 6,000 acres of forest. Although we have one pack that spills into the southern part of our property, another pack on the northern part of the property. And we'll pick up coyotes one day on a camera trap and a wolf the very next day on that same trap. So, they're using the same habitats, and it's surprising. But there you have it.
I wouldn't want to, whatever the coyotes are doing right, according to them, I still would not want to be a coyote in that area, because change is going to come, I would imagine.
I think you're right. And, when you get acclimated into a particular place and study it over several decades, you begin to see the ebbs and flows of population numbers. And, we're just perhaps at one of those points where we're waiting for the coyote population to drop, and it just hasn't quite happened yet.
Well, changing gears a little bit and to something that is near and dear to everybody here at Rewilding, talking about connectivity. So you have islands like everywhere else that are bifurcated by roads and logging and development and all of those kinds of things. From a connectivity point of view, are there opportunities that you're looking at or that you have noticed to better protect the forests in your area or in the larger area?
Yeah, in the larger area, there's actually a fairly extensive network of public lands that runs from north central Minnesota, including the Superior National Forest, the boundary wires, down through Wisconsin with state and national forests, including the Nicolet and Chequamegon National Forests, the Northern Highlands and State Forest. Over into the Upper Peninsula with its national forests and state forests, including the Ottawa and the Huron National Forests. So there is sort of that natural connectivity provided by a public lands network. So along with the public lands, we have all the problems that we've seen with public lands management over decades. We've got the legacy of decades of bad management of road densities that are just ridiculously high. And then also sort of scattered throughout parts of the region are a lot of vacation homes as well. This is an area with lots of glacial origin lakes from the last ice age, and cottages all along the shores of those lakes. So there's connectivity, but there's a fair amount of fragmentation as well. And, in terms of trying to think about the future, there's all sorts of possibilities in terms of what might happen. You can imagine a scenario where you get a depopulation of rural areas as people move into the cities, following natural disasters for which there's just no money to rebuild. Wisconsin, I know, has seen some major flooding this year. Highways and bridges over streams completely eliminated. At some point, some of these areas might be abandoned, and which would provide opportunities for connectivity. And of course, the flip side of that is you might end up seeing sort of the opposite of more people trying to move out into these rural areas. So ultimately, the potential for connectivity is there. And it's really going to be over the next several decades in terms of how things play out with our increasingly topsy-turvy climate and everything that goes along with it in terms of how people are going to respond to those changes in the landscape. And then as a result, how's the landscape going to respond to the presence or absence of people?
You've no doubt seen an awful lot of plans over the years with work from the Wildlands Project, and I was the executive director at Sky Island Alliance in the mid to late 90s and worked on that, one of the original big connectivity plans that came out of Wildlands. Keeping those kinds of maps in your mind, what in terms of feasibility a Great Lakes Wildway would look like? Where might it run if you were drawing the map today?
Well, I did a map back in 2001 that was published in the Natural Areas Journal. I did that with Glenn Barry and Steve Ventura and Don Waller, and we were just playing around with some ArcGIS back at that time, and looking at things like road densities and availability of public forests, and looking at existing forest cover. And we found that the Upper Peninsula of Michigan is extremely wild, as is the Arrowhead of Minnesota. And for those not familiar with the Upper Midwest, the Arrowhead refers to the region basically north of Duluth. Duluth is at the far western part of Lake Superior. And there's a part of Minnesota that sort of shoots off to the northeast and comes to sort of a point up on the north shore of Lake Superior. These are all really wild areas, low human population densities, high amount of public land space, high forest cover, and because it stretches almost all the way around the south shore of Lake Superior and into all the way over to Lake Huron, there's just an incredible opportunity there. The greatest degree of fragmentation, the greatest challenges are actually going to be sort of in north central Wisconsin, where there's a fair bit of development compared to the other two places. But at the same time, there's still some nice remote areas of habitat there, including some jack pine barrens that burn quite frequently, and as a result, have very low human population densities. So there's potential there with especially in Michigan and Minnesota. And it's just a question of getting good connectivity through Wisconsin. The wolves would tell us that there's good connectivity, but wolves appear more adaptable and less wilderness dependent than we would have thought 2 or 3 decades ago. So those might not be the good indicator that we're looking for. Something like a pine marten might give us a better indication of habitat connectivity in the landscape.
That's a really good insight into the problems that are faced when people do sit down and go, where would we connect the dots? Where would we put these islands together with cores and buffers? And what could we use as, a keystone or umbrella, whatever you want to call it, species? And a lot of people might think you'd use wolves but people like you on the ground really know what probably would be the best thing. And that assumption would be wrong in this case. You would want to look for something like a pine marten and base it on that. And that's the importance of being able to work with people on the ground who really know what's going on there. And you can't just look at the whole globe and go, let's just base this completely on wolves and bears and pumas. And there might be some other things that we might want to at least consider to throw in the mix, because you really have to do that, don't you? It's nice to help people understand the issue and why we want this connectivity here and there by basing it on a charismatic species. But as a biologist, you know that there's an awful lot of really fine points in developing these things, or there would be if you were to be developing these things, so that real connectivity that was meaningful in a really big way in terms of biodiversity of an area, not just one species or another having that connectivity.
I think that's exactly right. And 20 years ago, I would have, unequivocally said, yeah, wolves are going to be the best indicator of where we should place a wildways network in this region. But the wolves and their sheer adaptability revealed that no, they're not going to be the best indicator. And maybe we should be looking for something else. And our pine martens in this region have not done especially well, despite there being protections in place to reduce harvest and trapping and whatnot. And it's not clear, even to the biologists, exactly why are they not doing so well. And it's thought, and there's not real good data on this, but at least the intuition is, it's really been the loss of old-growth forests and the absence of large living and dead trees that they use for denning and using as sort of runways that is really the key missing linkage. And so as we bring back older forest, we can start creating habitat for the martens, and the martens can provide that overall connectivity. But that's not something I would have thought about 20 years ago. But it takes time out in the woods, and it takes time working with other biologists and making observations and trying to sort things out to sort of figure out what those key indicators are going to be.
Final question for today, and I think we're going to need to have you back, especially when you start getting numbers on the studies that you're working on that had just started, because I'm keenly interested, I'm sure our listeners are too, to find out what you have and your students have found. But in general, we like to wrap these up trying to get a gauge for what our guests would love to see. And as a professor, you have a unique view here. What would be your advice for young people interested in biology? Any particular areas that need study in your mind, in your area? Maybe it's specific geographically, or types of jobs that can really make a difference, or subjects that are valuable to a career in the natural sciences?
Sure. A lot of my master's students are not going on for PhDs. They're going to get their master's and then go out and work in the consulting world or work in wildlife biology. And so I've given this sort of a fair bit of thought. And there's a couple, if you sort of think of your, what you can contribute as a jigsaw puzzle, the key pieces that are really going to help put together a solid career where you can make a real difference include things like first and foremost, just cultivating a curiosity of the natural world, getting out and making observations, leaving the books at home and just going out and observing and trying to figure out on your own, what are you seeing and what's going on, and sort of develop those outdoor skills and those observation skills as best you can. If you're in school pursuing a degree, geographic information systems and learning how to use computers to do mapping, and not just mapping but also modeling, is critically important for going forward. It's a marketable skill, but it's also a really creative skill that sort of helps you visualize not just what's there but also what's possible. So I encourage all of my students to learn GIS. I encourage my students also just to pick a group of organisms. It doesn't matter if you're in the birds or beetles or frogs. Pick a group and just learn about it. Go out. If you're in birds, you should be out with Audubon every spring when the migrants are coming through, and learn your birds and learn from other people who've been watching birds for longer than you have, because they might not have biology degrees, but they have incredible insights that they've built up over the years that have made them good birders, and they have insights that we don't necessarily have in sciences. So learn from, don't necessarily just learn from scientists, learn from everybody out there who's connected to the natural world in some way. So if you can combine, a passion for organisms, a passion for curiosity, and some mapping skills, if you use that as a base, that'll take you a long way, especially if you're interested in the sciences and working on research projects. If you bring those skills to the table, you're going to make important contributions.
Tom, I feel like we've started something today that's demanding that we check in with you periodically, because you're in motion, you're really doing stuff on the ground, and it develops on a daily, weekly, monthly, yearly basis. And I think you've given me more questions for another episode than I was planning. So thank you, first of all, for taking the time for being on Rewilding Earth podcast and for being one of our very first to kick this off. I really, really appreciate it.
Well, it's been my pleasure. It's been great talking to you, and to all the rewilding folks out there. Please carry on.
Thanks for listening to the Rewilding Earth podcast. Be sure to visit rewilding.org to subscribe so you don't miss past and future episodes. And while you're there, please consider supporting Rewilding by making a donation or subscribing to the Rewilding Earth newsletter.